When we think of Vikings, it's easy to imagine axes, ships, and conquests. But behind every warrior was a body that needed constant energy to row, fight, and survive in one of Europe's most hostile climates. The Viking diet wasn't random. It was a survival strategy refined over centuries of necessity. Although we often romanticize them, Vikings were farmers, herders, fishermen, and gatherers who knew how to make the most of every resource from land and sea. The Scandinavian regions, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, had long winters, short summers, and poor soil. Farming wasn't easy, so each season dictated what was eaten and how it was preserved. During the warmer months, Vikings harvested, hunted, and preserved food by salting, fermenting, or drying it to endure the extreme winter cold. The need to preserve food was key in their food culture. One of the pillars of their diet was meat. They raised animals like pigs, cows, sheep, goats, and chickens, using every part of the animal. Pigs were especially valued for their fat, ideal for cooking and preserving. Meat was eaten roasted, boiled in soups, or stewed, but it was also smoked or dried for storage. Lamb was another frequent protein source, and in religious feasts, meat was offered to the gods. However, fresh meat was not an everyday luxury. Animal proteins were rationed and combined with vegetables and grains. Fish, on the other hand, was abundant and ever-present. Vikings were expert seafarers and fished in rivers, lakes, and seas. Herring and cod were the most common, often fermented like the famous Swedish surströmming, which has Viking roots, or sun-dried for winter. They also hunted seals and whales, especially in Iceland where land provided fewer options. Along the coasts, seafood like mussels and clams completed their marine diet. Milk and dairy products were also essential. Though fresh milk was hard to preserve, Vikings produced cheese, butter, and fermented whey, a drink known as surmjölk, similar to yogurt. These dairy items provided crucial fats for surviving the cold and were stored in clay or wooden containers. They were also easy to transport during travels and expeditions. As for vegetables, crops were limited but not absent. They grew kale, onions, turnips, leeks, carrots, and on a smaller scale, legumes like broad beans and peas. Turnips were among the most consumed vegetables, as they endured cold well and could be stored for long periods. Seaweed was also collected and used in soups or as a salt supplement. Grains were the main source of daily energy. They cultivated barley, oats, and rye, key ingredients for making rustic, often flat, unleavened breads cooked on hot stones or in simple ovens. They also made porridge-like dishes served for breakfast or dinner, sometimes mixed with butter, milk, or dried fruits. Speaking of fruits, while the climate wasn't great for large harvests, wild berries like blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, and currants were gathered, along with small apples that could be dried for storage. These fruits provided not just flavor, but essential vitamins to prevent diseases like scurvy. The Viking diet wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient, nutritious, and well adapted to a harsh environment. Their cooking, though rudimentary, followed a survival logic that was admirable. Viking nourishment wasn't just about what was eaten, but how it was prepared. Their cooking techniques were simple but clever, adapted to available resources and the rhythm of Scandinavian life. Fire served both for heating and for preparing food. There were no chimneys as we know them today, but there was a central space in the home where a constant flame burned. Over this fire, iron or ceramic cauldrons were placed to cook soups, stews, and porridges. One of the most common cooking methods was boiling. Vikings cooked large amounts of food, meat, fish, vegetables, grains, and legumes, all together in hearty, calorie-rich stews. They used wooden ladles and hot stones to help maintain the temperature. Another fundamental technique was roasting. Meat was placed on wooden or iron spits and turned over an open flame. Simple stone ovens were also used to bake bread and dry ingredients. But Viking cooking wasn't limited to the household. During long sea expeditions, food needed to be practical, durable, and easy to transport. Vikings didn't have kitchens aboard their drakkar ships, so they carried dry and preserved provisions. These included dried or smoked fish, which was long-lasting and rich in protein, salted or cured meat, mainly pork or lamb, stored in barrels, flat, hard bread made from oats or barley, similar to a thick biscuit that could last for weeks, firm cheeses and butter wrapped in leather or stored in wooden containers, and grains and cereals that could be mixed with water and cooked once they reached land. But Viking cooking wasn't limited to the household. During long sea expeditions, food needed to be practical, durable, and easy to transport. Vikings didn't have kitchens aboard their drakkar ships, so they carried dry and preserved provisions. These included dried or smoked fish, which was long-lasting and rich in protein, salted or cured meat, mainly pork or lamb stored in barrels, flat, hard bread made from oats or barley, similar to a thick biscuit that could last for weeks, firm cheeses and butter wrapped in leather or stored in wooden containers, and grains and cereals that could be mixed with water and cooked once they reached land. They also carried dried fruits and nuts, sources of quick energy and vitamins. Additionally, they brought a traditional alcoholic drink, mead, a fermented mixture of water, honey, and natural yeasts. It wasn't just for feasts, but also a safer alternative to water, which could easily become contaminated during voyages. Light beer made from barley was also consumed, sometimes flavored with aromatic herbs for preservation. On land, food preservation techniques were equally clever. Salting, smoking, and fermenting were common methods. Fermented food remains have been found in Viking settlements, including a type of butter buried in bogs, a method to preserve flavor and texture in cold climates. Even the famous Swedish surströmming, fermented fish with an extremely strong odor, has cultural roots dating back to the Viking Age. Interestingly, Vikings also used wild herbs and local spices to flavor their meals. While they didn't have access to Eastern spices, they used ingredients like wild garlic, dill, mustard, angelica, and Nordic cumin. These plants added not only flavor, but also medicinal properties. Viking feasts, on the other hand, were special occasions. They were held after conquests, alliances, or religious rituals. The best meats were offered, along with fresh bread and mead served in carved horns, accompanied by music played on harps or bone flutes. Eating well was a symbol of status, but also a way to give thanks to the gods. Archaeological remains found in noble graves often include cooking knives, cups, and even animal bones, indicating the symbolic importance of food in both life and death. In summary, Vikings were not just warriors, they were experts at preserving, cooking, and transporting food in a harsh environment. In Viking culture, eating was not merely a biological need, it was a deeply social and symbolic act. Unlike what we might imagine in a society of rough warriors, Vikings had rules, traditions, and hierarchies, even around food. Each meal reflected an individual's social role, the balance between genders and generations, and the connection between the earthly and the divine. In daily life, meals began early. The first meal of the day was known as dag, equivalent to breakfast, and the second was natmal, an evening dinner. Between the two, no other meals were typical, though the wealthiest could afford an occasional snack. In addition to barley flatbread, warm porridge and fermented whey were common at breakfast, while dinner was usually more substantial, featuring cooked meat, boiled vegetables, and, if lucky, some fish or cheese. Food was primarily prepared by women, who played a central role in managing the household. Although Viking women did not go to war, they mastered the art of preserving, transforming, and serving food. Their culinary knowledge was highly valued, and their ability to manage household resources could determine the family's survival through the winter. Children began participating in food-related tasks from an early age. They gathered berries, helped collect eggs, or cared for smaller animals. Learning to live off the land was part of their education. The elderly, meanwhile, held positions of respect at the table and often received special portions during communal meals. At larger gatherings, such as Yule, a winter festival that would later influence Christmas, food also held spiritual meaning. Sacrificing animals like pigs or goats was common, and their meat was shared as a symbol of communion with the gods.